The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across the schoolyard of Pine Ridge Elementary as Min-ho Kim clutched his backpack tightly against his chest. It was his third week at the American school, and each day felt longer than the one before. The 12-year-old boy took a deep breath and walked through the heavy front doors, his eyes fixed on the polished floor tiles. Min-ho had moved from Busan, South Korea, just last month when his father accepted a job at a tech company in California. Everything was different here. The food, the buildings, the language that still twisted his tongue into knots despite years of English classes back home. "Hey, Min-ho," called a friendly voice. It was Raj, one of the few classmates who made an effort to talk to him. "Ready for Mr. Reynolds' class?" Min-ho nodded with a small smile. Raj was nice, but most of the other kids either ignored him or whispered behind his back, making fun of his accent or the Korean lunch his mother packed. Mr. Reynolds' social studies class was studying influential figures in American history. As Min-ho slid into his seat in the back row, he noticed the pictures displayed on the whiteboard. Famous athletes, movie stars, and historical figures. One photo caught his eye immediately, a bearded man in a karate stance. Even from where he sat, Min-ho recognized Chuck Norris. "Today, class, we're discussing modern American heroes," Mr. Reynolds announced, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "People who have made significant contributions to our culture." The class perked up. This was more interesting than the usual history lessons. "Who can name someone they consider a modern hero?" Mr. Reynolds asked, scanning the room. Hands shot up around Min-ho. Students called out names of basketball players, actresses, tech billionaires, and YouTube stars. Mr. Reynolds nodded approvingly at each suggestion, writing some on the board. "What about martial artists?" Mr. Reynolds asked, pointing to the Chuck Norris picture. "Anyone know who this is?" "Chuck Norris," several students shouted at once. "That's right." Mr. Reynolds smiled. "Chuck Norris is not only an actor but a martial arts champion who helped popularize karate in America." Min-ho's heart began to race. He knew something about Chuck Norris, something important that connected to his own family. His grandfather had told him stories many times, showing old black and white photographs that Min-ho had always treasured. Without thinking, Min-ho raised his hand. It took Mr. Reynolds a moment to notice the quiet boy in the back. "Yes, Min-ho. Did you want to add something?" The classroom fell silent. Min-ho rarely spoke up in class. His face grew warm as 28 pairs of eyes turned toward him. "My grandfather," Min-ho started, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather trained with Chuck Norris in Korea." There was a moment of silence before Mr. Reynolds' lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Really?" he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Your grandfather trained with Chuck Norris himself?" Min-ho nodded, gaining confidence. "Yes, when Chuck Norris was in the Air Force in Korea. My grandfather was a taekwondo master in Osan." A snicker came from somewhere in the classroom. Then another. Soon half the class was laughing. "That's quite a claim, Min-ho," Mr. Reynolds said, making no effort to quiet the laughter. "Chuck Norris is famous worldwide. Next, you'll be telling us your aunt dated Bruce Lee." The laughter grew louder. Min-ho's ears burned with shame as he sank lower in his seat. "I'm telling the truth," he said softly, but no one heard him over the laughter. "All right, settle down," Mr. Reynolds finally said, but the damage was done. "Let's continue with our discussion about verifiable facts." The emphasis on verifiable wasn't lost on Min-ho. For the rest of the class, he stared at his textbook, wishing he could disappear. When the bell rang, he was the first one out the door. During lunch period, Min-ho sat alone at the far end of a table. He wasn't hungry anymore. The rice and kimchi his mother had carefully packed that morning sat untouched in his lunchbox. "Is this seat taken?" Raj appeared with his tray. Min-ho shook his head, grateful for the company but too embarrassed to speak. "Don't worry about what happened in class," Raj said, opening his chocolate milk. "Mr. Reynolds can be a jerk sometimes." "But I wasn't lying," Min-ho whispered. "My grandfather really did train with Chuck Norris." Raj looked skeptical but kind. If you say so, man. I have pictures at home, Minho insisted. Old ones from the 1950s. Cool, Raj said, changing the subject. Did you finish the math homework? Minho knew Raj didn't believe him either. Nobody did. It was just another reason he didn't fit in here. Back in Korea, everyone in his neighborhood knew about his grandfather. Master Kim was respected, his dojang one of the oldest in Busan. Here in America, his family's legacy meant nothing. The rest of the school day dragged on endlessly. In every class, Minho felt eyes on him, heard whispers and occasional giggles. By the time the final bell rang, he couldn't wait to get home. The walk home was short but felt like miles. With each step, Minho replayed the moment in class when everyone had laughed at him. Why had he raised his hand? Why had he said anything? He should have just kept quiet like usual. When Minho reached his family's apartment, he was surprised to find his grandmother there. Halmione had come to stay with them for a few months to help the family settle in. She was in the kitchen, the aroma of doenjangjigi filling the small apartment. Minho-ya, you're home, she said in Korean, her face brightening. How was school today? Minho dropped his backpack and mumbled. Fine, but his grandmother had always been able to read him, like an open book. She stopped stirring the stew and studied his face. What's wrong? Did something happen? Minho tried to hold back the tears that suddenly threatened to spill over. He was 12, too old to cry. But when his grandmother wrapped her arms around him, the warmth and familiar smell of her cardigan broke something inside him. They laughed at me, he finally said between sobs. I told them about Harabaoji training with Chuck Norris, and they all laughed, even the teacher. His grandmother's embrace tightened. They laughed because they don't know, she said softly. They don't know our family story. Minho pulled back, wiping his eyes. But I'm never going to talk in class again, never. His grandmother shook her head, a determined look crossing her face. No, that's not the answer. Your grandfather would not want you to be silent about our family's honor. She paused, thinking. Perhaps it's time to show them proof. How? Minho asked. His grandmother's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. I still have connections, Minho-ya, and your grandfather had many friends, even in America. Minho didn't understand what she meant, but something in her voice sparked a tiny flame of hope inside him. Now go wash up, she said, returning to her stew. Your mother will be home soon, and we have much to discuss at dinner. As Minho headed to the bathroom, he wondered what his grandmother was planning. Whatever it was, he couldn't imagine how it would fix the humiliation he had suffered today. But for the first time since the laughter erupted in Mr. Reynolds's classroom, Minho felt a small flutter of something that might have been courage. The smell of kimchi jjigae and fresh rice filled the small apartment as Minho's family gathered around the dinner table. His father, tired from a long day at the office, loosened his tie while his mother set down the final dish, crispy fried fish that reminded them all of home. Minho pushed his food around his plate, the events of the day still weighing heavily on his mind. You're not eating, his mother noted with concern. Are you feeling sick? Before Minho could answer, his grandmother spoke up. He had a difficult day at school. Minho shot her a pleading look, but Halmione continued, switching to Korean as she often did when discussing important matters. He told his class about his grandfather's connection to Chuck Norris, and they laughed at him. Minho's father put down his chopsticks and sighed. Minho, you shouldn't make up stories to impress your American classmates. But I didn't make it up, Minho protested, his voice rising. You've seen the pictures. You've heard the stories. Pictures of what? His mother asked, confused. Minho's grandmother rose from her seat without a word and disappeared into the small guest room where she was staying. When she returned, she carried an old wooden box, worn smooth with age. The family watched in silence as she placed it on the table and carefully lifted the lid. Your husband never cared much for his father's history, she said to Minho's mother. He was always looking forward, never back. But Minho should know where he comes from. From the box, she pulled out a faded leather photo album. The binding cracked as she opened it, revealing black and white photographs protected by thin sheets of translucent paper. She turned the pages slowly until she found what she was looking for. "Here," she said, pointing to a photograph of two young men in martial arts uniforms. One was clearly Asian with a serious expression, standing in a formal pose. The other was a young American with a crew cut, smiling slightly at the camera. "This is your grandfather," she said, pointing to the Korean man, Kim Tae-sung. "And this," she moved her finger to the American, "is Chuck Norris." Min-ho stared at the photo in amazement. He had seen it before, years ago, but had forgotten many of the details. In the picture, both men looked so young, nothing like the legendary Chuck Norris from the movies or his grandfather as Min-ho remembered him. "This was taken in 1958, his grandmother explained. "Your grandfather was already a respected taekwondo instructor in Osan when the American Air Force Base was established nearby. Many American servicemen came to train with him, including a young airman named Carlos Ray Norris, Chuck Norris's real name." Min-ho's father leaned forward, studying the photograph with newfound interest. His expression softened. "There are more," his grandmother said, turning the pages to reveal additional photos. Group pictures of Korean and American men training together, newspaper clippings in Korean, and even a handwritten letter in English. "They trained together for nearly 2 years, she continued. "Your grandfather always said that young Norris had exceptional discipline and talent. When Norris returned to America, he took with him not just taekwondo techniques but also your grandfather's philosophy about martial arts being a path to inner strength." Min-ho's mother reached for the album, gently touching one of the photos. "I've never seen these before," she whispered. "Your father-in-law didn't speak of the past often," Halmione replied. "After the war, after losing so much, he focused on rebuilding. The dojang became his life." Min-ho remembered his grandfather's dojang, the training hall with its polished wooden floors and walls lined with Korean flags and calligraphy. He had visited many times as a small child, watching in awe as his grandfather, even in his 70s, moved with grace and power. But his grandfather had passed away when Min-ho was only 8, taking many of his stories with him. "Why didn't you ever tell me more about this?" Min-ho asked his father, who looked away, almost embarrassed. "I wanted you to look forward, not back," he said, echoing his mother's words. "In America, we start fresh." Min-ho's grandmother snorted, softly. "And lose who we are? No, the past shapes us." She turned to Min-ho. "Your grandfather was more than just a man who once trained with someone famous. He was a master who survived war and hardship. He rebuilt his life through discipline and honor. This is your heritage, Min-ho." She rose from her seat again and disappeared into her room. This time she returned with something wrapped in faded blue cloth. Carefully she unwrapped it to reveal a black belt, the fabric worn but still strong. "This was your grandfather's first black belt, earned when he was only 16. He wanted you to have it when you were ready." Min-ho reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the belt. The fabric felt rough against his skin, carrying the weight of years and memories. "I don't know anything about taekwondo," he said quietly. "Dad never wanted me to learn." His father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I wanted you to focus on studies, on modern skills." "There is time for both," his grandmother interrupted. "The discipline of martial arts strengthens the mind as well as the body." She stood up straight, her small frame suddenly commanding. Despite her age, she moved with precision as she demonstrated a basic taekwondo stance. "Your grandfather taught me as well," she said with a hint of pride. In those days it was unusual for women to train, but he believed everyone should know how to protect themselves. Min-ho watched in astonishment as his grandmother, who he had only ever seen cooking or tending to her garden, performed a perfect front kick. "I can teach you the basics," she offered, "if you want to learn." For the first time since the humiliation in class, Min-ho felt a spark of excitement. "You would teach me?" "Really?" His grandmother nodded. "It would honor your grandfather's memory." Min-ho looked at his parents. His mother smiled encouragingly, but his father still seemed uncertain. "Dad?" Min-ho asked hesitantly. After a long moment, his father nodded. Perhaps I was wrong to turn away from our traditions. If you want to learn, you should. Minho jumped up from the table and hugged his grandmother tightly. When can we start? Right now, if you like, she said with a smile. But first, she turned to Minho's parents. I have been thinking about this problem at school. The disrespect shown to our family cannot stand. What are you planning, Mother? Minho's father asked suspiciously. The older woman's eyes twinkled with determination. I still have connections. Your father had many friends, even in America. Some have stayed in touch over the years. What kind of connections? Minho asked. His grandmother smiled mysteriously. Let me make some calls tonight. There are people who remember your grandfather with great respect. Minho didn't fully understand what his grandmother was planning, but for the first time since the laughter erupted in Mr. Reynolds's classroom, he felt hope growing inside him. Whatever tomorrow might bring, he would face it knowing who he truly was, the grandson of Master Kim with a legacy worth being proud of. The morning sun streamed through the blinds as Minho practiced the basic taekwondo stance his grandmother had taught him. For the past 3 days he had woken up early to train before school. His muscles ached in places he didn't know could hurt, but there was something satisfying about the discomfort. Bend your knees more, his grandmother instructed from the doorway of his bedroom. She was already dressed for the day, her gray hair neatly pinned back. Power comes from a strong foundation. Minho adjusted his stance, feeling the burn in his thighs intensify. Like this? His grandmother nodded approvingly. Better. Now hold it for 1 minute. As he struggled to maintain the position, Minho's mind wandered to the day ahead. It had been nearly a week since the incident in Mr. Reynolds's class, and though the teasing had mostly died down, he still caught occasional whispers and snickers when he walked through the halls. He hadn't spoken up in class since then. Time, his grandmother announced. Now get ready for school. Remember what I told you. Stand tall even when it's difficult. Minho nodded, though his confidence wavered. It was easy to feel strong in the safety of his bedroom with his grandmother watching over him. School was different. At breakfast, Minho's mother placed a bowl of steaming rice and fried egg in front of him. Don't forget about your heritage project, she reminded him. It's due next week, right? Minho had almost forgotten. Mr. Reynolds had assigned a personal heritage project 2 weeks ago. Each student was to research their family history and present it to the class. The timing couldn't have been worse. I don't want to do it, Minho muttered, poking at his egg. His father looked up from his newspaper. Why not? It's a good opportunity to learn more about where you come from. Because everyone will laugh at me again, Minho said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. They don't believe me about Harabaoji. His father and mother exchanged glances. Before either could respond, his grandmother spoke up. Then make them believe you, she said firmly. Show them proof. Tell our family's story with pride. Minho stared at her. How? The photos, for one thing, she answered. And I've been making some calls. Trust me, Minhoya. This is your chance to set things right. Something in her tone made Minho curious. What kind of calls? His grandmother smiled mysteriously. You'll see. For now, focus on your project. I'll help you after school. Throughout the school day, Minho found himself thinking about the heritage project. By the time the final bell rang, a plan was forming in his mind. Instead of taking the bus home, he walked to the public library near the school, pulling out his phone to text his mother that he'd be late. The librarian, a kind older woman with gray-streaked hair, helped him find books about Korean martial arts history and the American military presence in South Korea during the 1950s. Minho settled at a quiet table in the corner and began taking notes. 2 hours later, his backpack was filled with photocopies, and his notebook contained pages of information. For the first time since arriving in America, Minho felt a sense of purpose. This project wouldn't just be about fulfilling a school assignment, it would be about reclaiming his family's honor. When he finally arrived home, He found his grandmother waiting for him with a cup of hot barley tea. "Look what I found while you were gone," she said, pointing to several items spread across the coffee table. More photographs, newspaper clippings in both Korean and English, and a small, worn notebook with his grandfather's handwriting. "Harabioji's training journal," she explained, handling the notebook with reverence. "He recorded every lesson, every student, every competition." Minho carefully opened the journal. Though many entries were in Korean, some were in English, presumably notes about his American students. And there, on a page dated June 15, 1958, was a name that made Minho's heart race. "C.R. Norris, excellent sidekick, needs work on blocks." "He really did train Chuck Norris," Minho whispered, tracing his grandfather's handwriting with a finger. "Of course he did," his grandmother said matter-of-factly. "Your grandfather never lied. He lived by the tenets of Taekwondo: courtesy, integrity, perseverance, self-control, and indomitable spirit." Minho spent the evening organizing his materials and planning his presentation. With his grandmother's help, he scanned the old photographs and created a timeline of his grandfather's life. He practiced pronouncing the Korean terms for different Taekwondo techniques and memorized the dates of important events. As the week progressed, Minho's project took shape. During the day, he researched at school and the library. In the evenings, he trained with his grandmother, learning basic forms and the philosophy behind the movements. By the weekend, he had created a poster board display featuring photographs, maps, and text describing his grandfather's journey from a Taekwondo student during the tumultuous years of the Korean War to becoming a respected master who trained both Korean and American students. The centerpiece of his display was a section dedicated to his grandfather's most famous student, with enlarged photographs of young Chuck Norris training at his grandfather's dojang, newspaper clippings about Norris's later martial arts career, and a family tree showing Minho's direct connection to this legacy. The night before his presentation, Minho practiced in front of his family. His father, who had initially been skeptical about the project, watched with growing pride as Minho confidently explained his grandfather's contributions to martial arts. "You've done well," his father said when Minho finished. "Your grandfather would be proud." "There's just one thing missing," his grandmother said. She disappeared into her room and returned with a small wooden box. Opening it, she revealed a tarnished medal on a faded ribbon. "This was your grandfather's first championship medal," she explained. "He won it when he was 17, competing against men twice his age. It represents his fighting spirit, the same spirit that lives in you." Minho accepted the medal with trembling hands. "I can't take this to school. What if I lose it?" "You won't," his grandmother said with confidence. "And it completes your story. Sometimes people need to see and touch history to believe it." As Minho carefully placed the medal in a protective case for his presentation, his grandmother's phone rang. She answered in Korean, speaking softly but with excitement in her voice. When she hung up, she was smiling broadly. "What is it?" Minho asked. "Just confirming an old friend will be in town tomorrow," she said casually. "Now practice your presentation once more, and then get some sleep. Tomorrow is an important day." Minho nodded, too focused on his project to wonder about his grandmother's mysterious call. As he ran through his presentation one last time, he felt a strange mix of nervousness and anticipation. Tomorrow he would stand before Mr. Reynolds and his classmates again. But this time he wouldn't be speaking as the new kid with unbelievable stories. He would be speaking as the grandson of Master Kim, with evidence to back up every word. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, Minho couldn't help but wonder what his classmates' reactions would be. Would they finally believe him? Would Mr. Reynolds apologize for laughing? Most importantly, would sharing his family's story help him feel like he truly belonged? With these questions swirling in his mind, Minho fell asleep, his grandfather's medal resting on the nightstand beside him, a tangible link to a legacy he was just beginning to understand. The morning of the presentations arrived with a sky full of clouds that threatened rain. Minho stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his button-up shirt. His grandmother had suggested he wear something formal to honor the occasion, so he had chosen his nicest clothes, dark blue slacks and a crisp white shirt that his mother had ironed the night before. "You look very handsome," his grandmother said, appearing in the doorway. "Like your grandfather when he was young." Minho smiled nervously, his stomach churning with a mix of excitement and dread. His poster board and materials were carefully packed in a large portfolio case his father had bought specially for the occasion. The medal rested in a small velvet box in his pocket. "What if they still don't believe me?" he asked, voicing the fear that had kept him awake most of the night. His grandmother placed her hands on his shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. "The truth has power, Minhoya. Today, you speak with your grandfather's voice. Stand tall." At breakfast, Minho could barely eat. His father, noticing his untouched toast, tried to lighten the mood. "You know," he said, "I was thinking about something last night. I've never told you, but when I was young I actually won a taekwondo competition myself." Minho looked up in surprise. "You did? But I thought you didn't like martial arts?" His father shrugged. "It wasn't that I didn't like it, I just wanted something different for my life. Your grandfather and I disagreed about many things." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "But he was a good man. An honorable man. I'm sorry I didn't share more of his story with you." The sincerity in his father's voice gave Minho an extra boost of confidence. If his father, who had distanced himself from these traditions, was now embracing them, then surely Minho could face his classmates with the same courage. As they were about to leave for school, Minho's grandmother handed him a small paper bag. "Your lunch," she explained. "Special kimbap the way your grandfather liked it." Minho peeked inside, seeing the carefully rolled seaweed and rice with colorful vegetables inside. It was a small touch of home, a reminder of who he was and where he came from. His father drove him to school that day instead of having him take the bus, helping him carry his presentation materials inside. As they approached Mr. Reynolds' classroom, his father squeezed his shoulder. "I have to get to work, but I'm proud of you, son. Call me later and tell me how it went." Minho nodded, watching his father walk away before turning to face the classroom door. Taking a deep breath, he walked in. The room was already buzzing with activity. Several students had set up their displays around the perimeter of the classroom, and others were practicing their presentations in small groups. Mr. Reynolds sat at his desk, checking names off a list as students arrived. Minho chose a spot near the window and began setting up his display. The poster board stood proudly on an easel, with additional photographs and documents arranged on the desk in front. He carefully placed his grandfather's medal in the center, still in its protective case but visible to anyone who approached. Raj wandered over, his eyes widening as he took in Minho's display. "Whoa, you weren't kidding about your grandfather, were you?" Minho shook his head, feeling a small surge of satisfaction at his classmate's reaction. "No, I wasn't." "These photos are really cool," Raj said, leaning in to examine a particular photograph of Minho's grandfather demonstrating a flying kick. "Your grandfather looks like he could take on anyone." "He could," Minho agreed, his voice filled with newfound pride. More students gathered around, drawn by the unusual display. For the first time since arriving at the school, Minho found himself at the center of attention for positive reasons. He explained the photographs to his curious classmates, gaining confidence with each question they asked. Mr. Reynolds called the class to order, explaining that each student would have 5 minutes for their presentation. They would go in alphabetical order by last name, which meant Minho, Kim, would be somewhere in the middle. As the presentations began, Minho tried to focus on his classmates' stories. There were fascinating tales of immigration from various countries, family traditions handed down through generations, and heirlooms with special meanings. But his mind kept returning to his own presentation, rehearsing the words he had practiced so many times. When Raj finished his presentation about his family's journey from India, Mr. Reynolds consulted his list. Next up is Minho Kim. The classroom fell silent as Minho made his way to the front. Standing beside his display, he took a deep breath and began. "My name is Minho Kim, and I am here to tell you about my grandfather, Master Kim Tae-sung, a taekwondo instructor who trained many students, including a young American airman named Carlos Ray Norris, better known today as Chuck Norris. A few students exchanged glances, but no one laughed this time. Minho continued, his voice growing stronger as he pointed to the photographs and documents on display. My grandfather was born in Busan, South Korea in 1935. He survived the Korean War as a teenager and later established his own dojang, that's a training hall, near the American Air Force Base in Osan. Minho explained how his grandfather had become known for his willingness to teach foreigners, unusual in Korea at that time. He showed the class his grandfather's training journal, pointing out the entries about his American students, including the notes about C.R. Norris. In 1958, Chuck Norris was stationed in South Korea as an Air Force policeman, Minho continued. He began studying Tangsudo, a Korean martial art similar to Taekwondo, and trained with several Korean masters, including my grandfather. Mr. Reynolds, who had been watching with growing interest, raised his hand. Minho, these are fascinating materials you've brought in. May I take a closer look at that journal? Minho nodded, carefully handing the precious notebook to his teacher. Mr. Reynolds examined it, his expression changing from skepticism to genuine curiosity as he flipped through the pages. The handwriting certainly appears authentic, he commented, returning the journal. This is quite a family legacy. Encouraged by his teacher's response, Minho continued his presentation with renewed enthusiasm. He explained how his grandfather had later opened one of the most respected dojangs in Busan, training thousands of students over his lifetime. My grandfather believed that martial arts were about more than fighting, Minho said, remembering his grandmother's words. They were about discipline, respect, and personal growth. As Minho reached the conclusion of his presentation, he picked up the velvet box containing his grandfather's medal. This was my grandfather's first championship medal, he said, opening the box to reveal the tarnished medal. He won it when he was 17, competing against men twice his age. My grandmother gave it to me to share with you today as proof of our family's legacy. Just as Minho finished speaking, there was a knock at the classroom door. Mr. Reynolds frowned slightly at the interruption but called out, "Come in." The door swung open, and the school principal entered, followed by an elderly American man with white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Minho stared in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. Though much older than in the photographs, the man's bearing and the distinctive shape of his face were unmistakable. The principal cleared her throat. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Reynolds, but we have a special visitor today who heard about one of your student presentations and asked specifically to attend." The white-haired man stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Minho. A smile spread across his face as he walked directly toward the stunned boy. "You must be Master Kim's grandson," he said, extending his hand. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." The classroom fell into stunned silence. Minho stood frozen, his hand half extended toward the elderly man who had just addressed him. Chuck Norris, the actual Chuck Norris, was standing in his classroom, smiling at him as if they were old friends. Yes, sir," Minho finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Kim Tae-sung's grandson." Chuck Norris took Minho's hand in a firm grip. "Your grandmother contacted my office last week. When she told me who she was, I knew I had to come." He glanced around at the display Minho had created. "This brings back memories." Mr. Reynolds had risen from his seat, his face a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment. "Mr. Norris, we're honored to have you visit our school." The legendary martial artist nodded politely to the teacher before turning his attention back to Minho. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the photographs on display. "Of course," Minho said, still hardly believing what was happening. Chuck Norris examined the old photographs with obvious interest, occasionally nodding as if confirming memories. When he came to the picture of himself and Minho's grandfather, standing side by side in martial arts uniforms, he smiled broadly. "I remember this day," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "This was after my first formal test. Your grandfather was tough. He made me repeat my forms 3 times before he was satisfied." The students were whispering among themselves, some taking out their phones to snap pictures. The principal, sensing the commotion, addressed the class. "Students, we have a very special guest today. Mr. Chuck Norris has graciously agreed to speak to you about his experiences training in Korea. Please show him the respect he deserves." Chuck Norris thanked the principal, then turned to address the class. "I wasn't planning to make a speech today," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being listened to. "I came because when Mrs. Kim called and told me her grandson was telling his class about her husband, my former teacher, I felt I needed to be here." He placed a hand on Min-ho's shoulder. "Master Kim was one of the finest martial artists I ever had the privilege to learn from. When I was stationed in Korea as a young airman, I knew nothing about martial arts. It was Master Kim who first showed me the discipline and philosophy behind the physical techniques." Min-ho could feel the eyes of every student in the room on him. Instead of the mocking glances he'd grown accustomed to, there was now awe and perhaps a touch of envy. "Master Kim taught me more than just how to punch and kick," Chuck Norris continued. "He taught me about perseverance, integrity, and respect, values that shaped not just my martial arts career but my entire life." He turned to Min-ho again. "Your grandfather once told me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'The true victory is not defeating your opponent. It is defeating the weakness within yourself.'" Min-ho nodded, recognizing the saying. His grandmother had shared many of his grandfather's teachings with him over the past week. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat, stepping forward with an expression of genuine regret on his face. "Min-ho, I owe you an apology. When you first mentioned your grandfather's connection to Mr. Norris, I didn't believe you. I should have given you the benefit of the doubt." The sincerity in his teacher's voice took Min-ho by surprise. He hadn't expected an apology, especially not in front of the entire class. "It's okay," Min-ho said softly. "I know it sounded unbelievable." "That's no excuse for how I reacted," Mr. Reynolds insisted. "Part of being a good teacher is listening to my students with an open mind. I failed to do that." Chuck Norris nodded approvingly at the teacher's words. "Admitting when we're wrong is one of the hardest lessons to learn," he said. "It shows real character." The principal suggested that Min-ho be allowed to finish his presentation, and Chuck Norris agreed, stepping to one side but remaining at the front of the classroom. With renewed confidence, Min-ho concluded his presentation, explaining how his grandfather's dojang had become one of the most respected in Busan, and how the values of Taekwondo had shaped his family for generations. "I'm still learning about my heritage," Min-ho admitted, "but I'm proud to be Master Kim's grandson, and now I'm training in Taekwondo too. My grandmother is teaching me." When he finished, the class erupted in applause. Several students raised their hands, eager to ask questions. With Mr. Reynolds' permission, Min-ho fielded their queries, with Chuck Norris occasionally adding his own memories of training in Korea. One boy asked if Chuck Norris would demonstrate some martial arts moves, and to everyone's delight, the aging legend agreed to show a few basic techniques, with Min-ho's assistance. "Master Kim always began with proper stance," Chuck Norris explained, demonstrating the traditional Taekwondo ready position. Min-ho mirrored his movements, hardly believing he was practicing martial arts alongside one of the world's most famous martial artists. After the demonstration, Chuck Norris presented Min-ho with something he had brought with him, a black and white photograph Min-ho had never seen before, showing his grandfather and a young Chuck Norris practicing kicks together. "I've kept this in my office for years," he explained. "I think your family should have it now." Min-ho accepted the photograph with trembling hands, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you, sir. This means a lot to me." As the class period came to an end, the principal announced that Chuck Norris had agreed to stay for a special assembly in the school gymnasium, where he would speak to the entire student body. The news was met with excited murmurs from the class. Before they left the classroom, Chuck Norris pulled Min-ho aside. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," he said quietly. "It takes courage to stand up for the truth, especially when others doubt you." "My grandmother says I have his fighting spirit," Min-ho replied. Chuck Norris smiled. "I can see that. The blood of a warrior runs in your veins. He paused, seeming to consider something. If you're serious about learning Taekwondo, I'd be honored to arrange some lessons for you at my ranch when you visit Texas. Your family would be welcome any time. Minho could hardly believe what he was hearing. Really? That would be amazing. They walked toward the gymnasium. Minho felt as if he were floating. The same hallways where he had once felt so alone and out of place now seemed different somehow. Students and teachers alike stopped to watch as he walked beside the legendary Chuck Norris, no longer the strange new kid with unbelievable stories, but someone with a heritage worth respecting. Outside the gymnasium, Minho spotted his parents and grandmother waiting. His mother was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while his father stood tall, a look of unmistakable pride on his face. His grandmother, small but regal in her traditional hanbok, which she must have changed into after he left for school, smiled knowingly at him. "You arranged all this, didn't you?" Minho asked her when they reached his family. His grandmother simply nodded, her eyes twinkling. "I told you I still had connections." As they entered the gymnasium together, Minho, his family, and Chuck Norris, the entire school erupted in applause. In that moment, Minho understood something his grandfather had written in his journal, words that had seemed abstract until now. The greatest victory is not the one that others see, but the one that happens within your own heart. For the first time since moving to America, Minho felt like he truly belonged, not because of the attention or the celebrity, but because he had found the courage to embrace who he was and where he came from. The grandson of Master Kim, carrying forward a legacy of honor, discipline, and indomitable spirit.